Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar with Incorsa. The topic is Advanced Indirect Rates, and we have Robert Jones with Left Brain Professionals here with us today for a great presentation. My name is Liz Brigson. I'll be your host for today. Before we get started, I do just want to take a moment to take a deep breath and just say how much we appreciate you all taking the time to join us today. I know there's a lot going on in the world, and I hope that, in this next hour, you can just really take time to focus and enjoy the presentation today. Kind of let everything that's going on, mute that and just enjoy the content today, and maybe get lost in a little bit of technical allocations, because it's an amazing thing that we can be here and we can still learn remotely, whether you're working from home or working on your deck or wherever you're working from. I know it's a different world than it was when we were all together last month, and we're really glad you're here. Just like always, want to just give a quick welcome to anyone who's new, and if you are new, let us know how you heard about us and where you're joining from. And if you've been with us for a while, we would love to hear what number webinar this is for you, and also where you're joining from. Maybe something you're grateful for, or if you want to share something you're concerned about, feel free to type that in the chat box as well. To get the most of the presentation today, that's the chat box that you'll use to interact with us. And we're really, we'll keep that monitored and keep that going back and forth. Also, the handouts, as always, are available for you to download from the GoToWebinar control panel. You can also download the handouts from your Incorsa dashboard. Today's webinar is 1 hour. You'll be able to earn CPE credit if you'd like. You'll want to respond to at least 3 of those 4 polling questions. And for those poll questions, we always love your feedback. Particularly, you will want to stay tuned in, because Robert is one of our presenters who really likes to make these comprehension-based poll questions. So please definitely make sure you respond to those polls. If you do earn CPE credit, you can download your certificate from your Incorsa dashboard an hour after the conclusion of the event today. If you have any questions, or if you have ideas for ways that Incorsa can, help support you in this time, feel free to email us at support@incorsa.com. We are on LinkedIn, and I am also personally on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you, so go ahead and head on out there if you want to say hello. This is Robert Jones. Welcome, Robert. Thanks so much for coming back and bringing this excellent series to us, to the Incorsa platform. Robert is an expert in government contracts and accounting. He has a master in accountancy from the College of Charleston. He has experience in business management, compliance, operations, and very specifically to the topics. Robert has been a controller. He's managed defense contracts, and he now has taken that experience, formed Left Brain Professionals, and he's building a team there. And he's an instructor and speaker, and really just one of the best professionals that you can learn from on these topics. So Robert, thanks so much for being with us, and I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be back, and thank you for everyone who's joining us today. Again, today's topic is advanced indirect rates. Excuse me. We are talking specifically about government contracts. I'd be curious for some of you want to throw something in the questions or chat there. Let me know how many of you are regularly working with government contracts, and maybe are you on the industry side actually working directly for a government contractor, or are you in a firm that maybe has some clients that are government contractors? I do want to dive in. Got a lot of great information to get through today. In fact, you're probably going to hear me. This might be one of the times I speak the fastest, because again, several slides here. Really exciting topic. Just quickly about us, we are a boutique accounting firm. We used to serve strictly government contractors, practice primarily accounting system design, implementation, and audit support. And some of the common tasks that we get involved with our clients, you can see are some of our team members there. Some of the tasks that we get involved with are things like indirect rates, which we're talking about today, cost and price analysis, pricing models, proposals, all kinds of fun government contract stuff. Our learning objectives today, we've got 4 of them. Identify the need for advanced indirect rates, list the advantages of using multiple or advanced indirect rates, describe how multiple indirect rates are structured. We'll actually have some Excel worksheets that we'll go through. I've got some examples put together for you. And then list the requirements for multiple indirect rates. All right, so, and the terminology I use here is, I say either advanced or multiple indirect rates. I mean the same thing. And where does this come from? So one of the common questions or statements that we get from new or existing clients is that they'll call and say, we are working on a contract or multiple contracts. We're doing a lot of work, we're invoicing, we're getting paid, but there's just not as much money left at the end of the month. That's one of the common things that we find. Sometimes we'll also, one of the comments that we'll get is they'll say, we know we're overpriced on this or we're underpriced on something else, and we don't know how to be more competitive in that pricing. And usually what we find is that these are companies that had one indirect rate, right? So they just had one multiplier, think one billing multiplier, but they were taking that one multiplier and applying it across, again, could be multiple products, services, it could be across multiple operating divisions. Again, a common situation that we see with a number of small clients that we work with is that they'll have an engineering and a manufacturing side of the house, and they've only had one rate. And so they take that rate, for example, with all of that manufacturing overhead, whether it's test equipment, could be heavy presses and lathes, depending on what type of manufacturing work that they do. And they end up applying that rate with that heavy overhead to all of their services, and now their services become overpriced, right? They're not competitive in the marketplace. So basically what we're saying is these companies, as they grow, and I apologize, I'm still fighting some allergies here. Basically what I'm saying is that we're dealing with companies that have become more complex as they've grown, and their accounting and their indirect rate structure did not grow in complexity to match that. So what are the advantages of having multiple indirect rates? They lead to better alignment of cost pools and bases, resulting in improved profit margins. Again, back to my basic scenario of engineering versus manufacturing. Well, in the manufacturing world, as I said, and we have a client that does a lot of heavy metal manufacturing stuff. So they've got lathes, presses, all kinds. I mean, you go to their facility, it's a huge manufacturing facility with all this heavy, very expensive, big equipment in there. But they also have a services side of the company where, they sell engineering services. Well, when you take the depreciation, maintenance, repairs, and all the stuff that goes into maintaining the manufacturing, right, and applying that again to those engineering services, well, that just doesn't make sense. But when we begin to split those, we now can take the cost of operating the manufacturing side of the business and align it to those prices, and the same thing then on the engineering side of the business as well. One of the other things that I'm going to insert here, I decided to insert it at this spot. We'll talk more about it, and you'll see it when we get to the Excel. But what happens, we sometimes have smaller companies that end up going kind of an interim approach to what I would refer to as advanced indirect rates. For those of you who are with us on the last webinar, we talked about the fundamentals of indirect rates, focused primarily on a single approach to fringe, overhead, and G&A, one multiplier. You may recall that we did not talk about BMP or bids and proposals and IRAD or internal research and development costs. While I would not necessarily say that these two particular costs lead to advanced or multiple indirect rates, the proper calculation of them comes into play, and it's the calculation of these oftentimes are done incorrectly, and so it causes problems, again, primarily in the G&A pool because these costs go into the G&A pool and they affect how the G&A base is calculated as well. Again, when we get to the Excel later in the presentation, I'll actually walk you through that. It's important to know that BMP and IRAD costs are treated as direct. So the contractor themselves are treated as if they are a customer or a client of themselves. Because they are treated as direct, then the BMP and IRAD labor also receive applied overhead. And since the BMP and IRAD costs are in the G&A pool, then we're taking a portion of the overhead that's related, again, to the BMP and IRAD. That's now coming into the G&A pool, something that we otherwise would not do. But because those because those overhead expenses are now moving into the G&A pool, they are removed from the G&A base. Again, you'll recall in the past we talked about having a total cost input approach or a TCI approach to G&A, and with that, most other costs end up in the G&A base, and that includes overhead. But this portion here that again gets moved into the pool has to come out of the base. It's one of those tricky little calculations. We find a number of people get it wrong. And one of the things here, one of the reasons we really point this out is auditors know this. This is one of those low-hanging fruits. If you go through an incurred cost audit or some other kind of DCA audit where they're looking at your rates, could be a proposal, could be some other reasons they would be doing an audit. But regardless, auditors know that this is something that companies get wrong. And even though the overall impact on the rates can be minor, remember auditors are always looking to shave a little bit away, right? They got to prove that they're doing their work and they're doing it well. So with that said, how are multiple indirect rates structured? First, we're going to talk about some intermediate cost pools, and this is probably one of the first steps that some of our companies go through, some of our clients go through. And an intermediate cost pool is simply a cost pool where we capture the costs and we allocate those costs out to another or other cost pools. Fringe, for example, that we talked about the last time, and we'll talk about a little bit today, is an intermediate cost pool, right? We take those fringe expenses, if you'll recall, remember we had applied fringe that we put into overhead, that we put into G&A, and then the applied fringe for the direct costs went into the base of overhead and the base of G&A. And again, just a quick reminder on that, you'll see it in the Excel. And a little hint there that's going to come up in a question, fringe is an intermediate cost pool in the way that we typically treat it. Facilities here, though, one of the other things that often will happen with companies is you'll have a director of engineering, a director of manufacturing. Manufacturing tends to be a much larger portion of the physical space, right? Because they've got all that equipment, warehouse, tools, and stuff like that. They have this big, huge portion of the building that they're using. And the director of engineering comes along and says, why am I paying half the utility bill? Why am I paying half the rent when the manufacturing person over there, they're using 3/4 of the building and I'm stuck back here in a corner? Well, one of the ways that we do that is we now take all the facilities costs, gather them into a separate pool, and then we allocate it out over square footage. Some of the types of expenses that typically go into facilities, as you see here, could be rent, depreciation, utilities, repairs and maintenance, taxes, insurance, and you could have separate labor, right? I mean, depending on the size of your organization, you could be in a situation where you actually have either employees on staff who are doing that, or maybe you outsource some of that labor. But regardless, you could have labor into the facilities pool as well. Another one is IT. Again, we saw this with a client. It was a similar situation where it was actually the reverse than the facilities. It was actually the manufacturing who came and said, I can never find the IT people when I need them. Every time I need them, they're always over there doing something on the engineering side of the house. So why am I paying half their salaries when they're always helping out the engineers? And so what we discovered is that in that particular situation, When we looked at the engineers, we found on average, each engineer had about 5 network drops because they had laptops, they had desktops, they had test equipment that was connected to the network, they had mobile devices and tablets, right? So they had a lot of stuff going on, but that the manufacturing people didn't. So every time there was something going on with IT, 9 times out of 10, you found them over working in the engineering side. So what we did is created another intermediate cost pool, captured all the IT costs in there, which obviously labor was a big portion of that, right? The company had an IT department, the cost of general hardware and software. To be clear here, this would be hardware and software that the entire company benefits from. So if I'm buying a specific laptop for an employee, it would actually get charged to their overhead in their department. But obviously we have servers, we have general software, right? Email software and other things like that that the entire company benefits from. So that goes into the IT pool. And then things like, communications, telephone, internet connections, right, that everybody in the company benefits from. We put those kinds of costs in the IT pool. You have a couple of options. You could allocate it out over the number of employees if that made sense. Again, that didn't necessarily make sense for this client where they had a department where, again, on average, the number of network connections was about 5 per employee. So it made sense to say, okay, can we identify the number of devices or the number of network connections, which they easily could, and then they just allocated that out over the number of devices. All right, let's kick off the first poll here for us, Liz, please.
That sounds good. Which of the following are not intermediate cost pools? IT, direct, fringe, and facilities. And we'll go ahead and leave this open. Everyone's responding quite quickly, which is great because I know you said you have a lot of information to cover. So we'll leave this open for about 10 more seconds here. And I can definitely relate from my days as an auditor to, all these different cost pools and also working with subsidiary companies. Everyone has an opinion, right, about how much IT do I really use? So having data is always the most important way to go. All right, we have responses from the audience. I'm going to go ahead and close this down, share the results. And we have kind of a mixed responses, but direct at 58%. So I believe that's the right answer, correct?
That direct is the correct answer. So congrats to those who were either paying attention or remembered some from the last webinar. All right, we talked about some of the intermediate cost pools. In the last presentation, I said another way that when we start talking about advanced or multiple indirect rates, we start talking about breaking out fringe overhead, so splitting into having multiple fringe pools, multiple overhead pools. And while we will not have multiple G&A pools, we will talk about a material and subcontract handling pool in a few moments. So what are some ways or reasons why you would separate out fringe and have different fringe pools? You might be in a situation where you have union versus non-union employees. And again, in that situation, you probably would be in a situation where maybe your union employees, the cost of benefits, for example, for them far outweigh the cost that you offer your non-union employees. And so you would want to be able to price out those that labor separately, right? Because if you have a single pool and you apply that single fringe pool across all and I'm not saying that just because you have a union and a non-union shop, for example, that you have to break this out. Simply saying that these might be reasons that you would do it. And again, the other reason, the real driver for this, and I've got a slide about this later in the presentation, there have to be some pretty significant costs involved that would require you to do it. Again, if maybe you had a small union shop, but most of your employees were non-union, then it may not make sense to break it out. If the benefits that you were offering, both union and non-union, were fairly similar, and the costs were not significantly different, it might not make sense to break it out. Again, you could break it out potentially over government versus commercial, where you had employees who worked strictly on one side or the other, and again, you were offering different benefits packages. SCA, I'm talking about the Service Contract Act. So if you have SCA covered contracts, you'll be well aware that you have a H&W or health and welfare that you need to pay. That can be a hefty burden for companies that otherwise may not provide those same level of benefits to their other employees. What's really important to note here are the words at the bottom of the screen. You need to have legally defined and segregated groups of employees. So for example, some up above, as I've clearly identified, that you would have union versus non-union employees, and that you have written plans that identify who qualifies for each of those, and exactly what those benefits are. So you can't just, willy-nilly break this up. When we start talking about labor and benefits, there are a lot of legal things at play that go beyond even just the rules and government contracts. If you're not familiar with that, you definitely need to talk to somebody who understands employee benefits. One of the other options, and we don't, and let me, to be fair, back up for a second, we don't see many people breaking out multiple fringe. It does happen, but I would say that is definitely less common than when we start talking about breaking out and having multiple overhead. So what are some reasons or ways that you would break out overhead? You might have separate office locations. As the example that we've given you here today is that San Francisco is vastly different, right? The cost of doing business there is vastly different than Columbus, Ohio. And in fact, San Francisco is significantly more expensive. Jenny in marketing was helping me putting this together, and you saw that she found some rental rates information from a January 2020 report there, right? So obviously, if I had an office in San Francisco and an office in Columbus, the cost of me providing services in San Francisco to my clients out there, I would have a different pricing model, aka I would have a different indirect rate structure for that office than what I would have here, because I would want to make sure that I'm, capturing my cost appropriately and recovering all of those costs. Other ways to do it in relation to operating locations, you might have a client site and a contractor site. I prefer this terminology. Some people use the terms on-site and off-site and sometimes that means different things to people. So do you mean on-site at your facility or on-site at the client's facility? So we'd prefer the terminology client site versus contractor site. But the cost of employees, or really the cost of the overhead for those employees, is cheaper at the client site, right? So if you have a situation, and we see this with a number of our clients, where they provide staffing at a government facility. So the government is already either paying rent or has depreciation if they own the building, right? They're paying the utilities, the taxes, the insurance, they're paying for snow removal, repairs and maintenance and all of that. And eventually what we see happen is, the government will come back to the client, to our client, to the contractor and say, hey, why are we paying overhead? Why are we paying your overhead rate on your employees that are sitting at our facility, right? Those employees are not benefiting from your overhead, right? They're not in your facility. They're not using up your electricity or anything else. And you don't see this necessarily right off. It's typically situations where you have a number of employees who are on a client facility for an extended period of time, larger contracts. Obviously somebody come and going occasionally is not a big deal. Maybe even if you only had one or two employees on a client site or a government site, it might not be a big deal. Again, we typically see it when you start getting, again, long-term contracts that involve a number of employees. I've already mentioned this several times. This is my go-to example is something like different or separate operating divisions, manufacturing versus engineering. Again, the cost of manufacturing is usually significantly higher. And I always joke that I can pack a bunch of engineers into a small space, right? Because they typically only need a PC, a printer, and a cubicle, and they're good to go. They don't need all of the other equipment. You could break out multiple overhead by product or service lines, right? So maybe what you're doing, let's say if you're providing a service, let's say you and I'm make something up on the fly here. Maybe you offer painting services and construction services and something else, and you want to be able to price those competitively in the marketplace. Well, obviously, if you had if you offered painting services for people's houses or buildings, right? I mean, yes, you have some overhead, right? You've got some vans or trucks, and and you've got some painting equipment, but maybe not that much. Versus if you had a construction side of the business where maybe you had backhoes and bulldozers and dump trucks, right? That stuff gets expensive. If you put all of that into one pricing structure, then your price for painting services might not be competitive in the marketplace. So again, it could be something where you break this out over, again, product lines or service lines. And it could be any combination of what we've gone through. In fact, we have, again, a number of clients who end up breaking out overhead between manufacturing and services or manufacturing and engineering. And because within the engineering or services side, they might actually have employees who are at their site and employees who are at the client site. So this approach to having a manufacturing, a client site, and a contractor site having 3 rates is something fairly common that we see on a regular basis. And you might also have somebody who does material and subcontract handling, something we're going to talk about in a couple of moments. With that, Liz, if you want to kick off the next poll for us, please.
All right, that sounds good. Which of the following are acceptable ways to split overhead? Select all that apply. So there's 4 different options there. Option to select multiple. We'll go ahead and leave this open for about 30 seconds. See how those responses are coming in. While we're waiting for those responses to come in, Robert, can you think of a time where have you ever had to mediate a discussion between 2 different business unit managers over how to split up the overhead costs? I liked your example about how 2 different cities have such varying cost of rent, for instance.
Well, yes, that, or even as I said, even when they're in one facility, those conversations around the facilities and IT where somebody says, hey, wait a minute, because oftentimes, right, what happens is somebody in accounting says, okay, we got 2 divisions, we'll just take the rent and split it in half, right? Well, that's not necessarily fair to who's actually utilizing those services. And that's where, and usually those conversations start happening, right, when you start providing P&L or other reporting to those managers, and they go, hey, wait a minute, I'm paying more than my fair share of something.
Definitely. We're going to go ahead and close this poll down. We have a lot of responses from the audience. We'll take a look at this together. And it looks like the first 3, everyone responded pretty closely. I think all 4 seem like good responses.
And the answer is that they are all valid responses, right? We talked about all of that. You could split overhead by an operating division, an operating location, a product line or a service line, or even, again, could be potentially some multiple combination of those as well.
So thank you, everyone. Great question.
All right, let's talk about that material and subcontract handling. All right, this is a pool that comes into play where you have a significant amount of materials and or subcontracts that you're handling on behalf of the government. And this could be a situation where maybe the nature of what you're doing is procuring materials and having it drop shipped to the government. So there's little or no handling on your part. Sometimes you have situations where the government has a project, there are a number of subcontractors involved or a number of contractors that could be involved in a project, and they don't necessarily want to handle all of that. So they say, you be the main contractor and you take care of all of the subs and we'll pay you a fee to do that. And so those are some of the situations where you could have a contractor that a significant amount of their costs involve, again, materials and or subcontracts on behalf of the government. Now, typically, as you may recall from, again, the previous webinar where we did that total cost input to G&A, that meant that our base of G&A included all of those direct materials and subcontracts. Well, what happens with companies is that as they grow and become more complex, one of the things that happens is that their G&A rate begins to climb. And that happens for a couple of reasons. Usually, right as they're growing, they start adding people in accounting and HR and IT, and those other G&A labor expenses go up. You oftentimes end up with business development and owners who get nice salaries, right? And so those drive up the G&A pool. And eventually you get to a point where that G&A rate that you are tacking on to these expenses, and there's no magical number, I'm just giving you some round numbers that we often see. But when your G&A rate gets above about 20 to 25%, that's where your customers start to say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on over there? And why are we paying, a 25, maybe even a 30% G&A on top of these materials that you're just drop shipping? Yeah, we recognize, right, you're doing some work and we're paying you for that, but why are we paying such a hefty fee on top of that to have stuff pass through? And so one of the things that companies will do is go ahead and create a material and subcontract handling pool. And the pool then, so the top level numerator becomes the people like the buyers, the subcontract administrators. Again, if maybe you do have a warehouse and that's part of what you're doing, so those warehouse costs and stuff would be in there. And then the base of this pool is, as it sounds, material and subcontract handling. It would be your travel materials, ODCs, and subcontractors that are then the base of that. And so you break that out, and then when you bill this to your client, when you have materials and subcontracts, you apply this new rate. So instead of, so you don't apply this in addition to G&A, you apply this instead of G&A. And then one of the things that happens is you end up by default with a G&A that is value added. That's the other approach to G&A. And when I do the Excel sheets here in a little bit, I'm actually going to walk you through the math of that and show you how it all works. One of the bullets here that's important to note, again, this isn't always true, but usually what happens with material and subcontract handling, and again, I always use the term significant, right? So we typically have significant amount of material and subcontracts, and the cost to buy and administer those things are usually nominal in comparison to those significance costs, and that's how we end up with a M&S-H rate that's lower than G&A. I would tell you that if you start to put this together and you were going down the path of considering an M&S-H rate, and all of a sudden you found out that your new rate was equal to or higher than G&A, then obviously either you're doing something wrong or you're really not in a situation that it makes sense to go ahead and make the change at that point. As I said, it does result in a value added G&A because what was the base of material and subcontract handling? I said that the base of this new pool was all of that material, subcontracts, travel, and ODCs. And so since we take that out of the base of G&A, then the only thing left in the base of G&A is direct labor and applied fringe. That said, there's a really important note here, and that is that you can always negotiate a material and subcontract handling fee that's less than your G&A without creating the separate pool. So for example, let's say you got a 30% G&A and your customer, as part of negotiations, come back and says, look, that's really just more than it's worth to us, we got to do something. If you know that's what your G&A is, and let's say you have audited rates to support that, and the government can't dispute that, so they're not saying that it's an incorrect rate, they're just saying that's a rate higher than I would like to pay, you can just negotiate a material and subcontract handling fee on that contract and actually bill that separate fee without creating the separate pool. You can do that, and it can be an interim step as you get ready to actually create the M&SH pool at a later date. All right, sorry, we kind of hit these room polls quickly, but I'm going to spend some time on the Excel sheets when we get to those in a moment. So if you do the next one here, Liz.
Very good. The next poll is up. Which of the following costs are not part of the base of MS&H? And this is the third of 4 poll questions. And again, Robert, it looks like the audience is responding very quickly today, which is fantastic. So we'll give it about 10 more seconds or so here. All right, we'll go ahead and close this down.
All right, so interesting responses there. So it says, which of the following costs are not part of the base of M&SH? Slightly tricky. I will say that the best answer is direct labor. So direct labor definitely would not be the base of M&SH. Subcontracts and materials would be. Travel would depend. You could potentially, as your M&SH base, have only subcontracts and material. You could include travel and ODCs. I would say that part of the answer to that would be, it depends. I would say that if you had a significant amount of travel, that might make sense to move those expenses over there. But definitely B here is the best answer. Direct labor would never be part of the base.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks everyone for responding.
All right, so let's go through now some of the requirements. I kind of hinted at this, but I cannot drive this point home enough. You need to have cost pools and bases that are clearly defined and easily segregable. This means that we can't just willy-nilly say, oh, we're going to create different rates because we want to have them. Well, we need to have a reason, right, and some logical way to do that. Typically is going to be some of the scenarios that we mentioned. You know, we've got different operating divisions, we have different operating locations, we have different product lines or different service lines. From the single rate perspective, there on the bottom of the screen, right? So previously, if I had a single rate where all of my engineering and all of my manufacturing costs were together, now when I create my new overhead, my engineering costs, right, then engineering overhead would be allocated over engineering direct labor, and my manufacturing costs or my manufacturing overhead would be allocated over manufacturing direct labor. Again, it's an area where we see people start to get into problems with the math because they'll try to break out overheads, but then they use the wrong base, and then you end up with the wrong rates. And when you end up with the wrong rates, what happens is, again, 9 times out of 10, what we see is that people are not recovering all of their costs because they didn't calculate the rates correctly, and therefore they also did not price everything correctly. You do need to have a general ledger structure that aligns with your new cost pool structure and with the way your business is organized. This can mean, and it depends on your specific accounting system and how it operates, but you are going to need some ways to use codes or classes or tags or some other piece of information in conjunction with the actual base GL account. Again, depending on your accounting system and how it operates and what it calls that, you know, most accounting systems have some type of GL extension code, and that's what you need. So it could be a base code plus a department, a base code plus a class, some other way to further slice and dice the data so that when we go to calculate the rates, we actually have the information that we need. You need to have tools that aid in this cost collection. This means things like timekeeping and expense reporting that, again, is connected to your GL so that when I enter my time against this project versus that project. And in the case, so let me talk briefly about project or job costing here. Obviously, we would have jobs or projects for all of our direct work. We highly recommend that companies set up jobs or projects for all of their indirect work, meaning that you have an overhead job and a G&A job. It aids in consistency, it aids in the data collection and analysis, and in fact here where you had multiple overheads, then you would have multiple overhead jobs. You would have an engineering overhead job and a manufacturing overhead job, for example, in the common sample that we keep going through here. Same thing with expense reports, right? I need to be able to make sure that expense reports, requisitions, purchase orders can all easily be coded to the proper GL code and extension. You know, whatever that extension is called, we need to be able to get all of the details to that level. And you got to have significant costs. I said this when we talk about M&SH, but it really applies across the board, whether you're considering a split of fringe, a split of overhead. You got to have significant costs to achieve the benefit, right? One, you don't do this to shave 1 or 2 percentage points off. Usually with things like overhead, what we find is that, let's say, for example, a combined overhead for a company that has manufacturing and engineering, we might see a situation where they have a combined overhead of like 175%. Well, 175% overhead again on engineering is rather high, and so now their engineering services are not competitively priced. And when you split, it's not uncommon. Again, there's no set hard numbers here, but it's not uncommon if you've got a combined rate like that your manufacturing rate might be well over 300%, and now your engineering rate comes down to maybe 50% or 75%, right? So in that case, yeah, you went through a lot of hard work to break this out, but the benefit was great, right? We had a significant impact on the rates. You wouldn't do this, let's say you had a combined rate of 100%, and now you did all this work and you split it out and your new rate was 110 and 90. Well, that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to go through all that work and do it only to have a minimal impact on the rates. Because the other thing to keep in mind is there's the upfront work of doing this, and it's usually not an easy task for many companies, right? Because again, we have to make changes to the GL, we often have to make changes and updates to our policies and procedures. We have to make updates to various reports, to the timekeeping and expense reporting and stuff. So there's a lot that goes into that. It also means that ongoing, there's a fair amount of maintenance. I'm not saying that it's a lot of maintenance, but again, it can be a fair amount of maintenance as you go in order to do this, and you don't want to do a lot of work to get a minimal amount of benefit out of it. Said it a moment ago, but I'll just say it again here, the basic math of splitting costs. Obviously, you're going to end up with multiple indirect rates. Here's where I have to remind people my favorite phrase, the math is the math. And if you take a single rate, if you're going to go back to my example of 175% for a single rate for a company that has manufacturing and engineering in one rate approach, when you break that apart, and you take the manufacturing overhead and split it over manufacturing direct costs, and you take the engineering overhead and allocate it over engineering direct costs, one of those rates is going to go up and one of them is going to go down, and you hope it goes in the direction that you want, right? I don't know that I've seen it not go that way, but obviously if you're breaking it up to get the engineering rates down to be more competitive, then you hope that that's what happens. And then again, by default, what we would expect is that the manufacturing rate would go up. We do have, and I think actually, Liz, I think we plugged in 5 polling questions. I think you got 4 on there, but I think we actually put 5 in the presentation. So we've got one here now, and then we've got some Excel to go through after this.
All right, so let's see. We do have this is loaded as the 4th poll question. So let's go ahead and run this poll. And then the bonus poll question, we're actually going to take that in the questions box. So This is the 4th poll question for CPE credit purposes. Which of the following are not a requirement for creating multiple indirect rates? All right. Well, this is interesting because we have one answer that is leading very strongly this time around. So go ahead and get your responses in for the fourth poll question. And we'll leave about 5 more seconds here. All right, we'll close that down, share those results out.
And it looks like people caught on. Yes, never did I say that you needed new software to do this. What I will say is that for our small clients out there, when they usually start embarking on these kinds of changes in their accounting policy and pricing, often the conversation of new software comes into play, but it is certainly not a requirement. So kudos to most of you out there for catching up on that. All right, let's dive into the math here. I realize there's a lot of information on the screen. The idea is just to be kind of visual and walk you through this. I do have some color coding on here to help, and I'm also going to overlay some information. So as we talk about fringe, in this case for today, I kept a single fringe pool. And what I did is just I've got some errors here to show you that obviously direct labor. Remember when we talk about fringe, that the base of fringe is all of my W-2 labor. So that includes my direct labor, my overhead labor. Notice that I have 2 overheads. So I have 2 overhead labors that need to come into play. If you go back for a moment here and take a look at that direct labor, notice that I have direct labor 1, direct labor 2. For my scenario here today, I just used 1 and 2. This could be, again, engineering overhead, manufacturing overhead. It could be product line. It could be locations. But notice that, again, direct labor, both my overheads. I created a material and subcontract handling pool. And so I pulled that over here. I've got some G&A labor and I have some unallowable labor. And all of that comes into the base of fringe, which gives me my fringe rate. Now I go to facilities and oops. So facilities, I don't have anything that pulls in from anywhere else. I just have that single facilities pool there. If you do take a look at the base of it, I think I can try to draw on the screen here. I think I can do this. If you look at this base here of facilities, you see that the base is not dollars, but it's square feet. Remember, we said that we allocated facilities over square feet. And so what we always ask for from clients is a copy of blueprints, or at least something that they can identify by department how much square footage each department is using. And then when I allocate that out, so you see over here, for example, on this overhead 2 that I've got applied facilities, that $1,852 came from taking 555 square feet, multiplying it by $3.34, and that was now my applied facilities. Let me go back and how do I, oh, there we go. Clear all those drawings out of there. All right, let's talk about overhead. Here's where things start to get tricky, and I hinted at this when we were talking earlier. So one of the things that we sometimes see is that people start breaking out these pools, and when you break out the pool portion, right, the numerator, you also have to break out the base portion, or the denominator, and you still have to have a logical, remember I've used this terminology before in other seminars, you have to have a logical causal beneficial relationship between the pool and the base. Well, if my overhead, if my scenario here was that I broke out overhead to be engineering versus manufacturing, then the pool would be engineering overhead and the base would be engineering direct labor, okay? So you see here that what I pulled in for my overhead 1 was my direct labor 1. I did not pull in direct labor 2, I pulled in direct labor 1. I also pulled in BMP and IRAD. In this case, and now I could, in theory, I could have had BMP and IRAD in both pools from overhead. But in this case, it was really related. It was BMP and IRAD labor that was engineering oriented. I'm going to say that my overhead one was engineering. So in this case, the expense itself ends up in the pool of G&A that you see over there. But we treat BMP and IRAD labor, remember what I said earlier in the presentation, we treat BMP and IRAD labor as if it were direct. And so it gets lumped with the associated direct labor down here to become part of that overhead rate. And then I also had some unallowable direct labor. And notice I have unallowable direct labor 1, unallowable direct labor 2. So as I'm talking about overhead 1, I'm always talking about direct labor 1 and unallowable direct labor 1. When I go to overhead 2, very same methodology. I now pull in direct labor $2. I pull in my unallowable direct labor 2. I don't have BMP and IRAD costs here because they were not associated with the work out of this group, so they're not in the base of this. So that's why you don't see those. My material and subcontract handling, the key, and now again, my approach that I took here was that I included materials, travels, ODCs, and subcontractors. You could, and again, there would be different reasons. Again, if I had significant travel and I had people maybe on staff that were part of that material and subcontract handling group who were coordinating that significant amount of travel, it would probably make sense at that point to go ahead and bring it over here. And quite honestly, if I went through the effort to do that, I would probably just bring the ODCs with it for simplicity's sake. But there would be nothing wrong with having material and subcontracts in the base of the M&SH pool and leaving travel and ODCs to be in the base of G&A. There's no regulations that say that you have to do it one way or the other. It needs to make sense and you need to be consistent about it. So there's no right or wrong answer with some of the, and in fact, let me just reiterate, there's no right or wrong answer into how you break out fringe, overhead, or whether or not you create a facilities intermediate pool. That's up to you as the contractor. Again, as long as the math is correct and there's a logical causal beneficial relationship between the pool and the base, you as the contractor have a lot of options at your disposal. So you just see, you just see where I pull all those costs over there. All right, let's talk about G&A. This is where things get a little interesting. You'll notice there in the pool section on the top of the numerator that BMP and IRAD labor is there. Notice that there's an applied fringe and an applied overhead in that BMP section. Remember I said that BMP and IRAD are otherwise treated as direct. And when we do allocations with the math, if I've got labor because I allocated fringe over labor, then the applied fringe portion needs to come through with it. Because I had overhead 1 allocated across my BMP and IRAD down there to the left, because I did that and I now have BMP and IRAD that I'm treating as direct in my G&A pool, I have to apply the overhead there. And then when you look at the base, if you looked at the base, you would notice that the overhead 1, for example, that's down there is allocated only to the direct labor, not to the BMP and IRAD. That's how I made sure that the overhead that got into the pool of G&A was excluded from the base of G&A. And again, what I just have here for some arrows in addition to the color codes is just so that you can see where the direct labor, where the applied overhead comes through. Again, notice there because it's direct labor 1, I apply the overhead 1 to direct labor 1. Same thing when I get to direct labor 2, I apply overhead 2. Similar thing for my unallowable direct labor, because again, they were the base. Remember, if you go back and look at the base of both overheads, the unallowable direct labor is in there, so I apply the appropriate overhead to those as well. And this is an interesting concept that I wanted to jump to here. We're down to a couple of things and a few minutes left. We have unrecovered costs, and we talked in the previous one about unallowable costs. Let me go back for a moment. We've got this unallowable cost down here on the bottom right. Well, there's another cost of unallowable cost. I refer to it as if you could see my air quotes of penalty. It's not really a penalty. I call it a penalty. And it's the unrecovered aspect of unallowable costs that come into play. Because we have to allocate our fringe and overhead and G&A over certain unallowable costs, not only can I not bill back the unallowable costs, I also cannot bill back the associated fringe overhead and G&A. And while this is all fictional here, and obviously I have an outrageous G&A rate of 57% in my scenario here, what you will see is that my total unrecovered costs that include the unallowable costs themselves, plus the associated fringe overhead and G&A, I have total unrecovered costs that are pretty significant in comparison to all of my other costs. Right, so that's one of the other aspects of unallowable costs that we don't get to talk about much. Just a reminder, we do have the indirect rate calculator tool on our website. If you go to leftbrainpro.com, and I will switch my screen really quickly. Give me just a second here. If you go to leftbrainpro.com, click on this tools, the indirect rate calculator is here. Note that the version that's out here is still that single approach to a fringe overhead and G&A. If you have or are contemplating multiple fringe or multiple overheads, talk to us. We can help build a calculator for you. It's difficult to build one of those that everybody could use because people would have different reasons and ways of breaking it out. And so it becomes a very customized approach there. So, but if you are doing that and you need help calculating those rates, please contact us. That's something we can do. With that, I would say, I kind of hinted at earlier, this is no small task. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not really rocket science, but it does require a fair amount of planning, preparation. Again, there are a lot of things that you need to change in your accounting setup and in your policies, procedures, and training your employees. All right, with that, we've got one more unofficial polling question here that I think, Liz, you're going to just tell people to put the answers in the question. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that would be fantastic. So how much help do you need in calculating advanced indirect rates? So if you want to go ahead and just head out to the questions box, let us know A, B, C, or D. A is we've got this under control. B is unsure. Do we need them? C is some, and D is lots. So go ahead. I see that we have a lot of people responding out there, so that's fantastic. A little bit of a different way to interact, but it is fun to be able to capture fifth question and get your responses on that. So we'll give about, let's see, 30 more seconds or so. Awesome. Seeing lots of answers. Very good. Well, we'll feel free to keep chatting. I'm going to go ahead and you can keep rolling as we come up to the top of the hour.
Yeah, so I guess now we can dive into some Q&A. I know we had some questions in there. If we didn't get to your question today or another question comes to you, please email us support@leftbrainpro.com. You can find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. So please follow us out there. And Jenny, if you're tracking questions, if you want to ask me some questions here.
Question, can you go ahead, Jenny?
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, can you tell us a little bit more about what went into the development of the tool and how we can access that and how the audience can use that to kind of get started if they're saying, hey, I'm in that category of B, C, or D?
Yeah, so again, the tool is on our website, leftbrainpro.com. You can click on the tools and get to it. There's a live calculator there that you can use. You can also download an Excel version. Again, keep in mind, this is only for that single approach to fringe overhead and G&A. If you are already breaking out or considering breaking out and having multiple overheads or creating an M&SH pool, contact us because each of those Again, it's nearly impossible to create a calculator that everybody could use because people would have different ways that they would be breaking that out.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I think it's so cool that your team took the time to develop that and make that available as a free resource. And very good. So we're seeing a lot of responses in that questions box. For those of you who are saying, hey, this didn't pop up on my screen. Again, this was a 5th question. So we already launched our 4 CPE questions, and this is just a way for us to identify who's out there saying, hey, I'm raising my hand and I could potentially use a little more help with this. So awesome. We're right at the top of the hour. As we get to the close, let's go ahead and just look at contact information, Robert, so the audience knows how to get in touch with you. Let's chat about our upcoming events and also a little bit about maybe a sneak peek at what we're going to be working on with the self-study course.
Sure. Yeah. So again, you can find us on social media. If you've got questions, if we didn't get to it today, please email us support@leftbrainpro.com. You can also find additional webinars on our website, and you'll be seeing us again here in the very near future on the Incorsa platform.
Yes, absolutely. So thanks so much, everyone, again, for taking the time to join us today. Robert will be back talking about developing your first cost and price proposal on 4/21. So that is April 21st. Over the next month or so, the Incorsa team will be working on converting Robert's first 3 presentations of the year onto on-demand self-study format. So for those of you who maybe are just tuning in for the first time, the first 3 presentations will soon be available for you on the self-study platform. So that'll be a fantastic way if you're saying, hey, I jumped in on advanced indirect rates and I want to catch up a little bit. That'll be a great way for you to do that. So stay tuned there. Going back to the housekeeping items for the event today, there is a course survey when you close GoToWebinar. So go ahead and take that survey. We love your feedback, and Robert definitely does take that into consideration as he puts the future programs together. You can log into your Incorsa user account to access your CPE certificate. The recording and the materials will also be available for you later on as well, so that you can check back in. I know there were some schedules with a lot of allocations, and those are just great materials that you can go back over and review and follow those patterns to really get the handle on this content. Again, if you have any questions, we'd encourage you to reach out to Robert and his team. And with that, we hope that you all have a great rest of the day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we hope to have you all back with us again soon. So Robert, thanks for an excellent presentation today, and we'll see you next month. Take care.
All right, thank you. Have a good day.